Hi, I'm Valerie. I'm doing a video series on spiritual disciplines based on a book by Richard Foster called Celebration of Discipline. And this week I'm going to talk about the spiritual discipline of submission. And I know that's a loaded word and it's very broad, so I'm going to start off with just kind of addressing that. So in our culture, especially American culture, we tend to think of submission in very negative terms. We think of like oppressive, authority figures. We think of, the boss and the hierarchy at work that is like, the top guy and all the little people that get coffee are not important in the company. We think of, that verse in the Bible about wives submit to your husband and how that verse has been twisted to mean what it doesn't actually mean and abused and used by men to oppress women. And so there's just a very negative sense of what submission is, especially in American culture where we, left for religious freedom. Like we started this country trying to, in search of religious freedom. And so, I want to just start off by explaining that submission is not what we think it is. It's not. God does not ever call us to submit to people that ask us to sin and ask us to go against His will. And when you submit to a person, it is not saying that you are of lesser value of that person or that you're inferior. And so if submission is, turns into something destructive, that is not the will of God, and that is not the discipline that I'm talking about. And it's also not, letting everyone walk all over you and always saying yes to people, because that is not, at its heart, submission to God. That is fear of man and wanting people to like you, or, fearing confrontation. So that is not submission. So Foster talks about submission in a totally different way, and he kind of goes off of Jesus' life and how Jesus talked about how Jesus viewed that. And and so with all of the disciplines, Foster always comes back to the purpose of the discipline is to connect with God, and the disciplines are never an end in themselves, but they're always a means to an end. And each discipline helps us to connect with God in a different way, and each discipline has its corresponding freedom that comes from it. And so, which is really, it's ironic, like the discipline of submission, we don't think of freedom in that, but there is so much freedom in it. And so, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit. If you look at the life of Jesus, that's kind of what Foster kind of starts out with, because it's so impactful when you really think about it. Jesus, who is God, who, created the universe, and really has, out of anyone, has the most right to ask everyone to submit to Him. He came to earth and submitted to God the Father and submitted to everyone around Him. And that doesn't mean that He did what everyone wanted Him to do, because He definitely didn't do what everyone wanted Him to do. But He definitely submitted to God the Father and did whatever He asked Him to do. And that included submitting to people, putting their needs before His own, and just really loving them in a self-sacrificing way. And so one of the things that Foster talks about, he calls it the touchstone of the discipline of submission, is self-denial. And we think of self-denial as being like self-hatred, or like this unhealthy, like, oh, I have no worth, and, you losing your identity and stuff. And it's really not that at all. So, he talks about when you deny yourself, and you're practicing submission, and really what you're doing is you're seeking the will of God above all else. And he describes it, and really the heart of it is the freedom of submission is having the freedom to not always get your way. And so when you're practicing this, it's kind of like when I was talking about the discipline of simplicity, where you are seeking God first, and even if that you have to put your own selfishness aside, your own needs and wants aside, you are practicing this discipline of submission, and what comes with that is this freedom to not get your own way all the time, and also just this freedom that our happiness does not have to depend on, if we're getting our own way, and we have this freedom to love other people no matter how they treat us, and also just this freedom to not have this sense of like being obligated to always be watching out for yourself and trying to meet your own needs, because who else is going to, and that's such like the mentality of this world, and it's so easy to fall into that, and so this discipline of submission really has such freedom, because we know that God is the one who is providing for us. He's the one that loves us unconditionally. And, just like when I was talking about simplicity, if you seek God's kingdom first, all of these things will be given to you as well. And God knows what you need. And, His ways are so much higher than ours. And He does have our best interest in mind. And so it's really that peace of mind and that freedom that comes when you are practicing submission, and it frees you up to see the value of other people and their needs, and to just really listen to God's voice, like I was talking about earlier. It's not always saying yes to every single person that asks you to do something, but really the practical application in it is every time an opportunity to serve somebody else comes before you, just bringing that before God, and just being willing to say yes, if He tells you yes, even if it's not convenient or it's hard or whatever. You have to practice some self-denial in that, which is difficult, and it's not something that happens naturally, and so it's really something we need to depend on God and to help us to be willing to be in a place where we are submitted to God no matter what He asks us to do. And so that's really the heart of this discipline. As far as more specific practical application, Foster talks a lot more about that in the next discipline I'm going to talk about, which is service. But for now, I'm just going to leave you with that thought of just coming before God and saying, God, what do you want me to do? Who do you want me to serve? And just coming before Him with a willing heart. And so that's it for this week. Stay tuned for next week. We're going to talk about the spiritual discipline of service.